Welcome to The Balancing Act, the podcast for mastering work, wealth and well-being, with me, your author and host, Sarah Brennand. Here we explore conversations, insights and expert advice through the lens of what truly drives high performance and sustainable success, aligning your money and mission, strengthening your mental and physical health, and creating a more intentional work-life balance. Each week, I'm joined by leaders, professionals and specialists who share how they navigate their own balancing act, along with practical tools and strategies that you can apply in yours. Today, I'm joined by communication specialist Gina Balarin, who works with leaders to refine not just what they say, but how they say it. We explore the nuance behind skilled communication, presence, pause, tone and intention, and why the most impactful messages are often shaped in the moments we don't film. This is a conversation about elevating your voice, understanding what isn't being said, and communicating in a way that really does land. Welcome, Gina, and thank you for joining me today, all the way from Brisbane in Australia. Today we're talking about skilled communication as a core calibration tool for sustainable success across all areas of personal and professional life. I recognise that you have built your career around your significant expertise in this area, but would love to start with where that fascination in communication and linguistics really began.
It's a lovely story, and it makes me think very fondly of my early childhood. In the nature of the place where I grew up, which was kind of a Judeo-Christian society, a lot of people would grow up with a Bible on their living room table or, the center of their home. Whereas for me, it was a dictionary. And it wasn't just any old dictionary. It was a dictionary in two parts that was this thick. And it had what my mum would say, thwack appeal. And when you drop it, it would actually go thwack on the table. And I have fond memories of asking my gran or my mom, what does that word mean? And they'd say, look it up in the dictionary, Gina. And so I've always been a lover of words, or for those who like this phrase, a logolept, or a lexiphonic logolept, which basically means lover of words. And that's really where my fascination with language goes all the way back to my grandmother, the English teacher, my mother, the journalist, and now me, the communications expert.
That's wonderful. So recognising that you've used your knowledge and skills in communication through, through kind of departmental application, through marketing, through, through the kind of the comms and the marketing and the advertising, but how you've shifted more specifically now to the CEO's voice. Just tell me about what the CEO's voice is and what that means to somebody who wants to excel in their profession.
I've always been in marketing communications, but in that time I realized that I have a talent for being able to hear, first of all, what people are saying that they can't articulate as clearly as they'd like to, and then secondly, to be able to hear what people are not saying. And this fascination with communication and marketing and content and writing also indulged my secondary and passion of a fascination with leadership and leadership communication and management, and how leaders can get more out of their people, more productivity, more efficiency, more passion, and therefore more sales when they actually are able to motivate and create clear instructions for their entire teams and organizations to follow. So the CEO's voice is me being the voice of the CEO and me helping CEOs and other C-level executives and their teams be as articulate as possible. And that as articulate as possible doesn't mean that they just say every word clearly, or that they don't have an accent, or that they don't make mistakes when they talk. It means connecting the intention with the message and with the audience. And those three steps actually have to come together to create something beautiful. So in essence, the CEO's voice is a combination of language, passion, leadership, and communication to help leaders go from not just good to great, but from great to extraordinary. And that extraordinary level of communication changes how they impact their teams and how it impacts their personal lives too.
And you touched there on the what people are not saying, because that's so important, isn't it? And are people generally, just from your experience really, not saying something because they're just not aware? Or how do you uncover that? Is it a blind spot, or is it something that they've not learned how to do? How do you, if they haven't got you with them, how do they know that something is missing or that they could benefit from changing it?
When I work with clients, they have to have 3 ticks in the box. Mm-hmm. And tick in the box number 1 is they have to have big brains. Tick in the box number 2 is they have to have big hearts. And tick in the box number 3 is they have to be really committed to change. Your question was, how do people become aware of what they're not saying? And then how do they change that behavior? Mm-hmm. Well, the simple answer is they have to be fascinated by how they come across and be interested enough to observe that and be humble enough to accept that they may not be doing what they want, and then be diligent enough to be able to make that change happen. Mm-hmm. So that's a slightly different point to hearing what people are not saying. And that is actually almost a 6th linguistic sense, if you think about it that way.
Yeah.
I can hear what people are not saying because I have spent many years observing their body language, their tone of voice, their pauses, their intonation, the volume, the speed, the understated nuances of what they're saying. And a lot of that is actually about pause. Okay. Now, I teach people about the power of pause, which is often that people speak too fast, and so they mean that people lose what you're saying, and then they actually don't pause, and then they get really flustered, and you see where I'm going with this. The other thing about the art of pause is actually being able to make your point and then stop and say nothing. And it is deeply uncomfortable for a lot of speakers because they don't know if they're going to be able to hold the floor. But it's also a fascinating test as to how authoritative you feel in that moment. Because if you do own the stage, if you are in control of the room, you can hear a pin drop if you pause. And that wasn't a deliberate pause. I was actually waiting for you to go to the next question.
Yeah. And so I'm interested in that one because you said about being on a stage, and we know that a lot of communication has moved online, hasn't it, as well? And does the same communication skills translate, in your experience, from a leader perspective, through different kind of means or models or ways, or is it different?
When you're using different media, you need to be aware of your audience expectations and also the context in which you appear. That general lesson, context is king, applies in every single communication situation. You asked specifically, what do people need to do in different contexts to be aware of how they fit in, and has it changed online? Yes, it has changed online. What do you need to be aware of? Well, really, you only have this much of your body to talk to people. So if you're doing a huge speech, you've got the whole ability to stretch your arms out, to touch, you can't even see my fingers as I do this, to touch the edge of the room and to bring people in with your gestures. Now, in an online digital world, because I've only got this much space, I only have this much capacity to do hand gestures. One of the biggest issues that people make is they obscure their face. And when they're talking, if they use their hands a lot, which is great, often you can communicate a lot of extra stuff with your hands, it can either get very distracting for people if you use the same gesture over and over and over again, or you use the same head nods every time you articulate a syllable. And I've had to learn to do this. I am very bad at using my hands. In fact, my husband once said to me, Gina, do me a favor. Sit on your hands. Now talk. And honestly, at the time, I was physically incapable of talking because my hand gestures were so intimately connected with my ability to string a sentence together. So that's something I've had to learn to do. And that applies particularly in a digital context, because if you do use your hands a lot, you need to learn to use your hands less. If you do move around on camera a lot, you have to learn to moderate what is appropriate for your audience. So yeah, that's just one of the elements of showing up in a digital world. And the other elements of showing up in a digital world are, where are you looking? Are you looking at your screen or are you looking at the camera? Now, in all honesty, my camera's up there, so I really should be looking at the camera rather than at you. But we want to have connections with people, which means we want to look them in the eye, which means that when you're recording, you may not be looking people in the eye. Another element of communicating digitally is the question of how much information do you put up on a screen? And often, if you're delivering a webinar or a seminar or presentation of some sort, you assume that people are either looking at your slides and not at you, or you assume that people are looking at you and not your slides. And in a lot of tools, your face might only be this big on a screen, which means no matter how articulately you speak, people can't see your face clearly, which means that all of your gestures and emotion that we convey through our eyes and our eyebrows and our mouths is lost simply because you're just too small to be seen.
Which I guess from that means that what you say and how you say it, particularly for things, like we're doing now, a podcast where visually, I naturally like to watch them, but you also need to be aware that when you're talking, somebody might be off walking their dog or, on a treadmill or driving to work in the car whilst they're listening. So I guess it's how your message translates, not just in the context that you're saying it, but also in the context that somebody's listening to it, possibly at a completely different time zone, in a different setting, in their world in a different way. So I think from the CEO's perspective, from the leadership perspective, how do you typically work with people to help them to construct messages? What's that process, or what's the thing that you find people value most?
I'm going to go back to a point that you made before I answer that question.
Yeah, of course.
Because you actually said it, you paraphrased it without realizing you were paraphrasing it. And it was something I was taught in Journalism 101. The medium is the message. Now, there was a guy by the name of Marshall McLuhan, and he wrote a book called Understanding Media. And it was one of the very first books, which is why we studied it in journalism, that helped you understand the media. And this comes back to context. If the medium is the message, it means on television, your message is very specific to the medium of television. If you are in a webinar, your medium is very specific to the articulation of a message in the context of a webinar. If you're on the stage, it's a totally different context, and context is king. Now, can you rephrase your question again? Because I think I got so obsessed with telling everyone about Marshall McLuhan and the medium is the message that I forgot what your question was. Sorry.
Look, I think, it was more around the messaging, really, at the heart of it. So how do you work with people to help them construct a message that carries and lands with the person who's listening in a way that the leader, the person giving it, intends it to, even though they might listen to it in a slightly different way? So is that about the messaging? Is that about how they construct it? Is that about being more ensuring that they have the same tone every time? Just some of the key things.
When you're constructing a message and you want to improve maximum comprehension, it is important to remember that a message is all sorts of elements to be able to create a perfect whole. Yes, you need to construct a message in a way that is logical, that your audience can follow. You also need to be able to get the right tone, the right speed, the right volume. But you also need to be able to understand what your audience can and can't hear. So that's the context in which they are operating. And you need to be able to understand whether what you're saying is likely to be received or not. Now, let's unpack some of those.
Yeah.
If you are creating a structure that is natural and comfortable to you, but your audience doesn't know where you're going with it, they can get very confused. If I am helping someone create a speech and the structure is something that I have created, but it's not comfortable for them, they're not going to be able to articulate that without hours and hours and hours of preparation. I was working with a client earlier this week where we had agreed that she wanted to include the audience, she wanted to ask them questions, she wanted to get them to raise their hands, she was happy to start with something that was challenging, to include facts and stats and stories. And so that's why we created the framework and the structure that we did.
Yeah.
But I made one fundamental mistake. It was my structure, not hers. And so she wasn't comfortable delivering that message in the time frame that we had available because it wasn't natural to her. She didn't want to start with a dramatic fact or stat. She wanted to start with an emotional story. She didn't want to end with a challenge to people. She wanted to end with a story of hope and aspiration. The structure was important to her as a speaker, and we had to get it right so that she could actually deliver a performance that was optimal for her and for her audience. And so part of the art of communication is in respecting what your audience can and can't hear. And I read a shocking statistic the other day, which said that 75% of people are not paying attention to your message at any point in time. 75%. 3 in 4 people aren't paying attention. Now, if you think about what we know about noise, that makes perfect sense. We are either multitasking, or we're listening to something else, we're distracted, we're maybe watching something while we're doing some work in the background. Even if we're in a room and there's nothing else going on, there's stuff going on in our heads. You might think, oh, look, that lady's hat looks really good, and all of a sudden you miss the key point that the CEO is saying on stage. But the fact of the matter is that there is a reason why people are encouraged to repeat themselves in presentations. It seems silly to say, I'm going to say something, then I'm going to say something again, and then I'm going to say it again. But honestly, in public speaking, there's this old adage, tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them. And it's relevant because you need to be able to help people follow that journey, tell them what you're going to tell them, to give them those insights, to help them understand what you're talking about, tell them, and then to wrap it up in a way that reinforces your key message at the end. Tell them what you told them. All of that does give you structure, but structure can be messed with. We'll use an example. If you've ever watched a television program where they begin with the end of the story, that is an example of structure being messed with. And this is a tool that is used very often in everything from a Netflix series to a TV episode. If you start at the beginning, then you get people to follow along patiently until the end, but we live in an era where everyone wants everything now. And so you're far more likely to capture people's attention if you begin at the end. So one of the very cool public speaking structures that makes a huge impact is to actually begin at the end, begin with the drama, begin with the impact, begin with the shocking statistic, and then explain that, and then lead people to the point, and you kind of come back to the end. So it's almost a circular structure that gets you to optimize that attention factor.
Yeah. I really like that, and I've seen that happen on stage a few times, where, and it doesn't ruin the story, you're right, it just makes you fascinated, and okay, how do we get there? So your interest is heightened really early on, isn't it? To see how you actually get there. There's a couple of things in there that I just wanted to pick up that you said. One of them is consistency, so having that same message and repeating it within perhaps a keynote or within a message, but I guess as well making sure that message is consistent in other things as well. So if they miss what you said, if they miss that particular meeting, they're going to pick that message up. It's going to come through in their emails, or it's going to come through, it's going to be repeatable. It's going to be not a shock. And that goes for how we develop our brand as well, isn't it? People expect things from you if you have consistent behaviour and things. So if consistency is is really useful in so many settings. My guess is that then if you're not inconsistent, that can be either a negative or it could be something that grabs attention, you know, if you're wanting to cut through the noise, for example. So I'm just interested really but particularly when it comes to communication styles, because if we have our own preferred style, what happens if we change it up a little bit? Does that mean we're not authentic, or does that just mean we're really cool and we can do this other communication style? What's your take on that?
You've kind of answered your own question. It depends on the skills of the communicator.
Yeah.
People can mix up communication styles when they are a master of the art of communication. If you haven't developed your own style in the first place, you may come across as looking inconsistent. But if you're still trying to figure out what your style is, then sometimes you need to be a little bit inconsistent until you've actually worked out what gives you the biggest impact.
Okay.
The speaker, Stephen Bartlett, comes to mind. Now, we both know him from a marketing background and context. He has a podcast called The Diary of a CEO, and he wrote a book also called The Diary of a CEO. Now, his podcast is fantastic because he interviews experts who are in their own right truly fascinating individuals. What is interesting is that Stephen's style hasn't necessarily changed over the years, but he and his team are very good at bringing out moments of drama within that style. So if we look at what you can do with your voice and what you can do with your language, I'm going to say something really loud. Apologies to anyone who was listening to that and had me suddenly shouting in your ear. But it attracted attention, didn't it? Mm-hmm. Just like if I whisper, I might attract attention too. And these are opposite extremes. The point is that in your style, people tend to favor a certain volume. Mm-hmm. And so if you can learn to vary that volume appropriately within context, you can create a whole world of communication that adds layers on top of what you're saying. Let's use an example. We're having a mental health day this Friday. No one has to come to work. That's the basic statement, okay? This Friday, we have a very exciting announcement. No one has to come to work. We're having a mental health day for the whole company. Okay. Notice how I varied that. I could also say, we're having a mental health day this Friday. No one has to come to work. Do you even know what I said? You'd have to listen to that 2 or 3 times to get the gist. And so great communicators are also great actors and actresses because they understand how their ability to vary language impacts other people emotionally. And one of the biggest challenges for those who see communication merely as a tool rather than an art is that they assume that what they say is exactly what people are going to hear, and they could not be more wrong. Because we're not just listening for words, we're listening for the whole package. We are listening for cues, we're listening for subtext, we're listening for nuance. And so you can say exactly the same sentence in different ways and create a different emotional impact on your audience. And I think a lot of executives underestimate that. Those who are very good at facts and stats tend to assume that everyone else needs facts and stats. But they don't. And even if they do, if you are able to present that fact and stat in a way that has an emotional nuance, all of a sudden, it carries so much more meaning. Likewise, if you're telling a story and the person you're talking to needs evidence, they're going to distrust you until you can connect your story to some kind of evidentiary-based thing that is trustworthy for them.
I think there's lots there in terms of and also highlights that people can just practice some of these things at home, you know, practice to say things in a different way, you know, just in the kitchen whilst you're doing something or whilst you're getting ready, or say it in the mirror, you know, in an evening. And just to because that's the other thing, isn't it? It's being comfortable trying something new, and there's loads of safe spaces that we can practice those things once we've got a bit of direction as to what we might want to do. And I think that linking the different delivery styles to the impact on emotion is really key. So if for example saying things in different ways is something to work on, what other things might you recommend that people can just do themselves to just start to practice to become more flexible in their communication?
Try messing with different volumes, try messing with different speeds, try messing with different emotions, and try messing with different levels of learning and training. Okay, so when I say messing with, of course, I mean playing with. The biggest challenge often for those who are very good at speaking, being prepared, is that they tend to over-prepare. And so I don't know if you've ever heard someone read a story that they've never read before. It can be quite hesitant and a little bit jumpy. If you've heard someone read a story that they're reading for the first time, but they kind of have a sense of where it's going, they can put more emotion into it. If you hear someone read a story that they've read 20 times, they've already learned a pattern. And they do that pattern over and over and over again. And often that means that they also learn a certain way of speaking, which may or may not help them actually deliver. So it's this experimentation that is interesting. And it means that if you are over-prepared, you lose the ability to bring a part of yourself that actually shares something special with the audience, that emotion. So when I work with C-level execs who are over-preparers, the thing that I will do just before they prepare is say, I am banning you from speaking or preparing or doing any kind of practice the day before. You're not allowed, because you are so well rehearsed that you actually need to give yourself time and space to be comfortable just bringing a bit of yourself to that message. And the thing that I will say to people who are very good at doing it off the cuff but not very good at preparing is pushing them to realize that their strength is in fact their weakness. If you are an incredibly good impromptu speaker, you rely on the ability to be an impromptu speaker. It means that when you are preparing, you forget what you're saying, or you can't make the connections between part 1, 2, and 3. And that ability to make connections in what you're presenting or preparing is actually a surprisingly important skill that people often underestimate. If you think of it like a series, like a Netflix series, you might binge watch a Netflix series because you're bored, or you might binge watch the Netflix series because the ending of the episode is so compelling that you can't stop yourself from going to bed an hour later because you have to watch the next episode. So if we think about our presentations and the transition between even every single slide as being that level of excitement, it is in fact the transitions that help people create more meaning. And the other mistake I made with the client who wanted to do the presentation starting with a story instead of starting with a dramatic fact is that she couldn't follow my transitions. So, of course, it was not going to feel comfortable and natural to her without hours of rehearsal, which she didn't have the capacity for at the time, because the logical transitions were in my head, not in hers.
Yeah.
So the lesson here is, if you have someone else writing your speeches, always, always, always make sure that you are comfortable with the transitions. And if you're not, change the structure. Because there's nothing worse than being halfway through a presentation. You can't remember what's coming next, and you can't remember how to get from point A to point B. You owe it to your audience to create that logical structure, sequence, and transition, because that improves their comprehension significantly. And it's just like going on a smooth car ride. Unless, of course, you want to make a dramatic stopping point, and then you stop and pause meaningfully, and then you start with a completely new subject matter, having indicated to your audience that you have in fact finished, so that you can begin cleanly.
Yeah. There's lots in there for people to play around with and have a go at, in terms of the repeated message, the how you say it, the structure, the pause, the volume, but also that difference in preparation styles. I'm just kind of thinking in my head of somebody that I was talking to yesterday who absolutely loves the more impromptu style, and then felt that they really kind of fell to bits more when they'd done this over prepared. And so I think there's a lot of self-awareness and self-learning in there, in that to actually be really good, we need to keep that understanding of ourselves and our own preferences, but then just start just kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit to become more comfortable in the other areas. Now, we've spoken a lot in terms of application in work as the CEO, but of course the CEO, when they're not at work, they are, you know, like the rest of us. Well, we think they are, don't we? You know, a normal human being. And the communication skills are, you know, we use those, we carry them across into all areas of our life. And actually, if we have developed really good communication skills for work, of course we'd want to also use those brilliant communication skills with the ones that we love and that we spend our time with. So, you know, do you have any experience of working with people or guiding them as to how they translate these skills consciously into the other areas of their life, so that they kind of maintain that connection?
We often live in two communication worlds, the worlds of communication at work and the worlds of communication at home. And just because we can be an expert communicator in one domain, it doesn't necessarily follow that we are an expert communicator in both domains. Mm-hmm. The most satisfying and amazing transformations I've seen in the C-level executives I work with is when they use a technique that they're not aware of at work, that they also do at home, and by changing their awareness and changing their behavior patterns, they can actually change their communication with their loved ones, which subsequently changes their relationships. Now, you may not realize that we actually all have communication patterns and habits. I don't know if you've ever been in an argument with someone you love, a spouse, a friend, a family member, and you realize you're saying the same thing, you're having the same kind of circular argument that you have many, many, many times before. What often happens there is that it doesn't really matter what the subject matter is, it's about the behavior pattern. And so what I'll often advise people to do when they're in conflict situations is exactly the opposite of what they always do. So if you usually argue back, try saying nothing at all. If you usually say nothing at all, try raising your voice. If you usually leave the room, try staying in the room, and vice versa. How does this apply in a work context when you're not going to be storming out of a room, presumably, if you're in the middle of a board meeting? It is effectively the ability to give yourself enough time and space to stop that fight, flight, fawn, freeze, instinctive response and choose a different path. So I've read that the emotional reaction that you get from anything, whether it's fear, disgust, exhaustion, anger, even happiness, the emotional reaction only lasts for 30 seconds in your body. Now, 30 seconds is a long time in communication, an uncomfortably long time. If we were to pause for 30 seconds here, half your audience would leave. Most of your audience would leave because 30 seconds is far too long to be quiet for in a podcast. But in a real-life context, you can often let people just talk for 30 seconds while you're able to, if you can, stop that emotional reaction and just go, hey, I am experiencing this emotion. I don't have to experience this emotion. I can choose a different path, and therefore I can choose my emotional response. Mm-hmm. In a corporate communications context, by which I mean you are in an office and you're talking or listening, one of the best behaviors is to try and change the habit of a lifetime. So I have a COO, Chief Operating Officer, I'm working with at the moment, who will often get very angry with his staff. And unfortunately, that means that because he's got a very, very quick brain, he wants to immediately answer the issue, address the issue, call out what he sees that the other person doesn't. Mm-hmm. He hasn't realized that that comes across as aggressive and belittling. He hasn't realized that that comes across as aggressive and belittling to his teams until we called that out to him. And he suddenly realized that he could still say what he was going to say, but if he gave them the grace to finish what they were saying and also to then pause for a significant period of time, in his case, I think it was only 4 to 5 seconds before he responded, he could immediately change the tone of his response. So let's say I say, we're going to make 20% of the numbers instead of 50% this month. And he would go, what? How can you do that? Instead, if he trained himself to pause for 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds, we're going to make 20% of our numbers instead of 50%. Really? Why? And if he paused for even longer and was able to derail the emotional constriction, we're going to make 20% of our numbers instead of 50%. I'm very surprised by that. I'd like to understand why. Can you tell me more? Totally different emotional response, and therefore totally different reaction from the person that you're talking to. It works in a corporate context. It works even better in a personal context. And that's why one of my favorite testimonials is not from my client, but from his wife. And she simply said, please tell Gina I say thank you.
That's wonderful. I think what you've done as well through that story is just demonstrate how skilled communication is absolutely intertwined with emotional intelligence. You know, that the emotional response, the recognition of the cognition in that pause to allow us to recognize or rationalize when a different response would be better but for our audience as well as perhaps for ourselves, and how we can use emotional intelligence to improve our communication or teach ourselves and practice communication skills that naturally help us build that self-awareness as well. They're so connected and such important skills. So just one final question from me. There is so much wrapped up in all the different things that you know you've spoke about today, that people can start to think about and consider and apply to improve their communication skills. What's the one thing that you wish you'd have known earlier in your life, in your career?
I wish I'd learned the power of silence sooner. I'll elaborate. When I was a child, I had to fight to get a word in edgeways because we lived in a family that would regularly talk all over each other. It's a habit I still do and drives my husband nuts because he prefers to pause and think in the middle of a sentence, which I find very flabbergasting even now after living with him for 25 years and being married to him for 23 years. I still don't know that he actually hasn't finished talking just because he pauses. But the lesson here is that actually most people don't listen to understand. They listen to respond. So if we don't give people the grace to let them finish what they're saying and the grace of our undivided attention, we don't let them feel heard or seen. I wish I had had the ability to not want to put my 2 cents worth in every single time. Because while what I have to say is often valuable, people usually come to the point that I was going to say in their own time. I don't have to interrupt them to prove that I know what they're talking about. If I actually just let them come to their own conclusion when they're ready. And that makes me a better listener. It makes me a better friend. And it makes me a better leader.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you so much for your time and all of your insight. I know that we could stay on here and talk for many more hours and still not cover everything. So I guess on that note, if you're happy to share with how people can contact you or find out more about the work that you're doing, and what's the best way for them to do that?
Please look me up on LinkedIn. Send me a connection request. And if you can't reach out to me that way, go to verbalistics.com.au. That's verbalistics.com.au. There's a lot of stuff you can find there, including a beautiful page called Goodies. And on the Goodies page, you can get access to more than 30 episodes of podcasts that I've recorded, a chapter of the book that I've written, The Secret Army, Leadership, Marketing, and the Power of People, as well as tip sheets about speaking and just general extracts on things like how do you do stories as a service? In other words, how do you collect stories from your customers and integrate that into your marketing abilities? All sorts of goodies. But the most important way of building a relationship is to connect with someone and have a conversation. So yeah, send me that message on LinkedIn and let's have that conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much.
It's been my absolute pleasure to speak with you today, Sarah. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to The Balancing Act for mastering work, wealth and well-being. You can head over to the website for further insight, links and resources related to this episode at www.balancing-act.co.uk, and remember to subscribe to catch all the new episodes as they're released.